The more things change, the more they stay the same. Very common phrase you'll hear. And bear it in mind, gentlemen, because we will be returning to that in a short while. But I'm sure it has not escaped your notice that in recent years, possibly the last decade, you will hear an endless caterwauling, endless complaining, endless finger-pointing about men who are addicted to pron and men who can't get off the internet, and more recently and more specifically, the threat of AI GFs, so to speak, with respect to men, and how they might get lured into such a temptation and it will ruin everything. And almost invariably, the people who tend to complain about this, who forecast doom, who prophesize this stuff, are people who are effectively living in different dimensions from the men that they like to complain about and point fingers at. Be they mainstream conservatives like the folks at the Daily Wire, or elite Chads like Chad Williamson, or pundits who write books or work in academia. Yes, indeed, the number of people are legion who complain about this. Or even seemingly friendly self-help gurus like Dr. K, the famous or infamous psychiatrist on YouTube who, quote-unquote, helps people. Healthy Gamer is the name of the channel. And they say a lot, and they complain a lot, and they point fingers a lot. And this might mislead you to believe that these people actually care about the welfare of men broadly. They care about men falling behind, not being able to do certain things that they ought to be able to do, not being able to do this and that, X, Y, and Z. You would think that. But what if I told you it's all just an illusion? It's simply not true. Now, I ask the question, why do they even care? Well, it's a bit of a rhetorical question because it's pretty obvious that they don't. And this always goes back to the fundamental status of virtually every man. Even the gifted ones, even the attractive ones. It's a question of degree, a question of being on a continuum, obviously. But men are disposable, right? If you've even paid a little attention to the rhetoric surrounding the whole conflict between those individuals in the so-called Holy Land, I'm not very interested in it, but you'll hear when they talk about casualties and people that have been slain, they're always talking about women and children. It's the middle of 2024, and they still talk in this fashion. They still talk about the end of human life in this way, and that just speaks volumes and boatloads. So we know what's up. Men have always been disposable, and in order to distinguish themselves as something special, as something valuable, they have to rise above the muck of what they used to be, whatever average that might be at any given time, at any given point in history, and distinguish themselves. That's what they have to do. It is a thing, it's true. But the converse of that is if they cease doing that, if they cease to achieve, if they can no longer achieve, if they're no longer capable, then they will fade back into obscurity, and no one will care. That's just the nature of masculine existence, which is why even people such as Chad Williamson are relentlessly pushing themselves, A, because status maxing, status seeking, it's an addiction, success, money, all these things are very addictive. But B, if he were to take a break, people would forget him. Yes, he looks good. Yes, he's attractive. Yes, for all I know, he's personable, but people would forget him because you got to stay in the spotlight. You got to stay relevant, meaning that if you don't do these things, if you don't stand out, nobody cares. How is this related to what I've been talking about with respect to so-called prawn addiction and the threat of AI girlfriends that's allegedly looming on the horizon? Well, we can tell because virtually all these men who, whether they actually have addictions or not, I mean, these are allegations, claims, we don't know. All these men that are purportedly addicted to prawn and about to fall in love with AI girlfriends, they're obscure. Nobody knows who they are because they haven't done anything with their lives. Maybe they're unattractive, maybe a combination of all the above. Who knows? But they're obscure. And if a man is obscure, we know, definitionally, that nobody cares about him. Certainly not broader society. Maybe some personal family relations like the mother, father, the uncle, the siblings might care. That's more likely. But broadly speaking, nobody cares. Not in that situation. So why do all these people complain about so-called useless men and their addictions? Oh, video games. I forgot that one too. Video games. The great evil of our age. Terrible. God forbid men engage in any escapism to get away from the misery of their lives, but that's a separate discussion for a separate time. So prawn addiction, video game addiction, and the looming threat of the AI GF. Well, inasmuch as they complain, they want men to be quote-unquote useful again. They want them to strive for things, not because they think the men are going to feel better as a result, which for all I know, they might very well. Men might feel better if they strive for things, achieve things, probably. Whether they succeed in the long run is a different question, of course. But they don't like the fact that men are not fueling their energy into maintaining and building society. Now, I'm not making the claim that a bunch of misfits and online addicts are somehow going to cause the collapse of society. That would be a bold claim. I've never made that claim. But there's a substantial number of men that have checked out for a variety of reasons, especially young ones. And they want the warm bodies to do the work. They need tax revenue, and they need, as is usual, human utilities. And some of them kind of get the idea that working for free and working for nothing isn't fun, which is essentially a lot of the situation these days with young men. You're asking them to bust their buttocks and haul buttocks and work hard with very, very shaky promises of a reward at the end. Of course, you can always argue that it's always been shaky. It's never been certain in terms of rewards and promises. But at least during the course of the last 70 or 80 years, yeah, there were certain protocols you could follow in earlier times that were almost definitionally rewarding to some degree. And most men of average stature, of average status, of average looks, could in fact live a decent life. Now, I'm not claiming we need to go back to that. It's impossible. Toothpaste out of the tube and all that jazz. It's the truth. We're not going back to that society where average blokes were able to get things that they can only dream of now. But it remains nonetheless a hard sell to say, look, you should bust your butt, do this, do that, because maybe, just maybe, you'll be able to achieve something. And if you were to listen to the likes of Chad Williamson, for example, who's been on record as stating multiple times that it's never been easier to stand out. Well, yes and no. He makes it seem like there's absolutely no competition. And yet there is a lot of competition, tons even, given the fact that there are billions of people in the world, and a lot of them are online. So that argument kind of falls by the wayside. What are the specifics of the arguments that they mount against the idea of prawn addiction and video game addiction, and specifically this recent concern about AI? Well, it's all about, according to them, a distortion of reality. Because, say, if you're prawn addicted as a young man and you watch a lot of weird stuff like hentai and other crazy types of prawn, then you'll be inclined to believe that actual women behave in a certain way that doesn't accord with reality. And there might even be a kernel of truth to that. The counterpart to male prawn addiction, I would argue, is female fan fiction addiction. We're talking about an incredible amount of things written, volumes and volumes. Not very much of it good, mind you, but a lot of things that a lot of young women, teenage girls are into, where they too have their fantasies about how men ought to act. And the males there are portrayed in an incredibly feminized manner because it's more relatable to the women. Yes, they're still men, but their affectations, the way they engage with the world, it's more relatable to women. And that's the counterpart. And that's actually a growing concern for some pundits. But because fan fiction, by the way, which has a lot of erotica in it too, I should just mention that, it's less explicit, because that's just how it works, right? Men are into the more explicit stuff when it comes to prawn and the carnal, and women are more into the implied and the build-up to that sort of thing. It's basically two sides of the same coin. That, yes, there is a distortion of reality in terms of how the opposite sex acts and interacts, and et cetera, etc. But in the case of men, as they don't really care, other than that we need good worker drones who are going to do the thing that they need to do without complaining, I don't really see the big deal. The big concern when it comes to the whole AI GF thing, which I still think is quite a long ways off, is this idea of the perfect GF. Some GF that just agrees with everything you say, does everything you want, yada, yada, yada. But if those types of men are already splintering off from society, aren't actively participating, who cares if they have a distorted perspective on gender relations and relationships. Again, something I've heard many times. Well, these guys are evolutionary dead ends anyway, and it simply doesn't matter, so let them do what they want. But of course, they still have objections to the activities they engage in, so it's a bit weird. It either bothers you or it doesn't. And a lot of these guys who are addicted to various forms of online entertainment, just say for the sake of argument, that's true, especially when it comes to pron and some kind of weird AI GF thing, potentially. Those are the types of guys that probably never had a shot anyway. You have to think about attraction, you have to think about phenotype. And I really am convinced that there are different types of facial phenotypes that correlate with certain activities. For example, you'll never see a proper jock, a football player, for instance, who has a recessed jawline, a really narrow jaw, pointy jaw. That kind of thing doesn't exist. Likewise, conversely, you're probably never going to see that facial phenotype, the broad, square jaw, hyper-masculine, high T, occupying the chair of mathematics at a university. That guy's much more likely to have a normal facial phenotype. And so if you take that idea of facial phenotypes and map it onto other things, what are the chances that the guy online who plays a lot of COD, who's addicted to pron, who's considering spending what little money he has on some AI GF, at least a nascent form of it, what are the chances that that guy has a realistic shot to engage with women and to have them be receptive? I'm willing to bet that very few of them look like Chad Williamson. There might be a few, some autists maybe, but most of them are going to be very average looking at best, not particularly tall, and in many cases below average. And then you could say, oh, they need to work on themselves, this and that. But again, not in the broader context of history and prehistory, but compared to the last 70 or 80 years, things are harder now. And so these are the types of guys that might even be wasting their time pursuing women in the real world, because every effort they make potentially could be met by only failure. I don't just mean some failure, a lot of failure, only failure. I just wish in general that these pundits, and I know we all have to engage in niceties and smoke screens, would just be honest. They don't give a damn about the welfare of men, broadly speaking. That's okay. It's the way it's always been. So just stop pretending, and stop pretending that guys that you probably wouldn't give the time of day to, either in terms of friendship if you're a male, in terms of engaging conversations with them, and certainly not romantically as a female, why it matters what they do. It doesn't. They're generally not bothering you, and they probably just want to be left alone. And that's just the way it is. Hence why I return to my initial statement, the more things change, the more they stay the same. As always, thank you for tuning in. Many special thanks to my patrons and donors on PayPal. You guys are the lifeblood of the channel. You hold everything together. You're like Atlas holding up the world, unironically, when it comes to this channel. Many, many thanks indeed. As for everybody else, if you can leave a like, share, comment, and subscribe, I guess it helps out the channel. Who knows? If I'm still alive, I'll check you out next time. Until then, may the gods watch over you. Bye-bye for now. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.